Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Arfat and welcome to episode number 2 of the Greco-Roman world behind the early Christians. Reading still from the world around the New Testament, from the world of the New Testament. And today's topic will be about the 6 different major Greco-Roman philosophical school. Philosophy is very important thing in the past. That is like formal education today. In the ancient world, if you want to be educated, you need to learn from philosophers. You will attend either one of these philosophical schools, and that is the education, the formal education of the past of the Greco-Roman world. This is also true during the time of the early Christians. It wasn't later on until Christians decided to learn the scripture, and then it became a formal kind of religious education for them. But until the advent of the church fathers in the 3rd and the 4th century, like Gregory of Nazianzus, Origen, before that in the 3rd century, philosophy was pretty much the main form of education. Um, the last philosophical school, the school of Platonism, was abolished sometime around the 6th century, but that is because it is no longer popular, and scripture is the mode of education in the Western Christendom at that time. And so I'm reading here from page 143. The 6 major Greco-Roman philosophical school. Okay, the school of Plato. Plato's school was known as the Academy, okay, and it passed through several distinct phases. The first was the Old Academy, which is from 347 to 267 BCE, during which Plato's early successors continued many of his interests and sought to systematize his thought. The two most important in terms of ethics were Xenocrates and Polemon. The story of the latter's conversion to philosophy became a staple of later narratives about the power of philosophy to transform lives. Okay? Philosophy was very influential at the time because it is they engage in debates and they engage to refute other philosophical schools, and so it is really an interesting study. The emphasis on practical morality is seen in Crantor's treatise on grief, which became highly influential in works devoted to consolation. Plato's school began to take a completely different approach when Arcesilaus became head of what is sometimes called the New Academy, and this is from 267 to 80 BCE, in which skepticism became the hallmark. Socrates' relentless questioning was taken as the model for inquiry, with suspension of judgment, okay, viewed as the necessary consequence of the impossibility of knowledge. The two most important representatives of skeptical phase of the academy were Carneades and Clitomachus. But one of its most influential individual was Philon of Larissa, perhaps its last scholar. He died in the 79 BC, to whom Cicero is frequently indebted in his main philosophical works. With Antiochus of Ascalon, another academic who strongly influenced Cicero, in this is during the period of Middle Platonism, which is from 80 BCE to about AD 250, begins. Okay? During this period, Platonism became more dogmatic and eclectic, and with various representatives drawing heavily on the thought of other schools, especially those of the Stoics, Peripatetics, and Pythagoreans. Major Middle Platonic figures include Albinus, Alcinous, Apuleius, Atticus, Eudorus, Maximus of Tyre, Numenius, and the writings of Philo of Alexandria, Clement of Alexandria, and Origen. Okay? With Middle Platonic ideas also reflected in Hebrews and in Paul's contrast between the inner and outer person. So all of these early church fathers, as well as Paul, they were influenced by Platonism. Okay? if you want to put it as a whole. Now, I do not have the time to get into what is the difference between the original Platonism, Neoplatonism, Middle-Platonism. For that will be a separate video. The final phase of the academy was Neoplatonism, which was introduced by Plotinus AD 204 to 269. This was about 150 years after Jesus, and continued by such individuals as Porphyry, Iamblichus, Celestius, Julian the Roman Emperor, Macrobius, and Proclus. Patristic thought in late antiquity was almost always heavily indebted to Neoplatonism. Okay, so Neoplatonism was somewhat the main form of influence that we have, and the early church fathers, they also adopted some kind of philosophical schools, like for example Origen, who wrote about 1,000 books and whose commentary is pretty much an allegorical commentary. If you read his works, and Bartman has produced a compendium of early church fathers' writings, published by Oxford. It's in 2 volumes. And if you started reading the church fathers, you realize that, and if you have a knowledge on philosophical schools, then you'll know that their writings have been influenced by major Greek philosophers. Now, the school of Aristotle. Okay, Aristotle founded his school in 335 BCE in Lyceum, a gymnasium located near a sanctuary dedicated to Apollo Lycius. Okay. Later tradition represented by Hermippus had Aristotle make use of its walkway, as a place for his teaching, and others suggested that Aristotle used to walk about there as he spoke. Both of these traditions are etiological attempts to explain the name associated with Aristotle's philosophy, which is the peripatetic school. In reality, the term peripatos probably derives from the public walk where the school met in the time of Aristotle's successor, Theophrastus, whose characters contains sketches of various distinctive types of human behavior, such as that associated with deisidaimonia. According to ancient testimony, and this is written by Plutarch, when Theophrastus died, he willed his and Aristotle's library to Neleus, at which point their works passed into oblivion. Meaning he dedicated his library to his successor. In the 1st century BC, however, the books were brought to Rome, where Amysus began, and Andronicus of Rhodes completed an edition of Aristotle's esoteric works, plus some by Theophrastus. Whatever the historical credibility of these accounts, they function to explain the relative insignificance of Aristotle and his school for much of the Hellenistic period, as well as the Aristotelian Renaissance that began as a consequence of this edition and reached a pinnacle with the appointment of Alexander of Aphrodisias to a chair in the Aristotelian philosophy between AD 198 and 209. Basically, what we have, the Aristotelian school, his ideas have been reformed and reshaped, and his works have been compiled and edited, and so we do not really know if that is what Aristotle himself would approve of. If you read later, during the Renaissance during the rediscovery of philosophy, this was later on when Muslims became the dominant force in the Eastern Mediterranean. A lot of these Greek works and Latin works, they were translated to Arabic, and if it wasn't for the Muslims who preserved these works, then pretty much the study of philosophy will not be prevalent in the Middle Ages as well. Because when Christian monks, when Christendom became more and more dominant over the Western Empire, over the Western countries, they stopped copying all these Greek works, and because monks would only prefer to copy scripture because that is what they believe. And Augustine himself really disliked the philosophers, um, and we found this true as well for a couple of church fathers as well. And so it is better for scribes to copy manuscripts of the New Testament, of the Hebrew Bible, rather than to copy philosophical works. But when Muslims conquered the Mediterranean, um, during the time of the Abbasids, the Umayyads before that, but during the time of the Abbasids, when libraries were started to be compiled and books were started to be written and mass produced, as well as during the civilization in southern Spain and North Africa, whereby we have huge libraries in Cordoba and things like that. A lot of these Greek works were being published, were being copied. Okay, they were very popular, and so that is why we have groups like the Mu'tazila and all these other groups who have adopted a kind of Aristotelian logic, and then they read the Quran and they make exegesis based on Aristotelian philosophy. And so that's why we have like Imam Al-Ghazali, who refute the philosophers. But we have Ibn Sina, who is influenced by philosophy, Ibn Rushd, who is influenced by philosophy, Aristotelian philosophy, pretty much Aristotelian philosophy, because Neoplatonism pretty much died out, and the one that survived is pretty much Aristotelian philosophy that is very common and very popular amongst Muslim thinkers of back then. But a lot of scholars have written against philosophy because it is actually detrimental if you try to read the Quran from a philosophical point of view. Okay? Because you start getting ideas whereby the Quran was created and things like that. So it is very confusing to the layman who do not understand how the Wahi was, how the Wahi works, how the revelation works. Then they might think that the Quran is actually written. Okay, whereas the Quran is actually not something that was written. It is actually the speech of Allah. Okay, and the speech of Allah is eternal. So the Quran that I have back there, okay, that is written by a man. Okay, but it is the speech that is actually eternal, because that is Kalamullah, the word of Allah. And so to a layman in the past and as well as today, those who who lack knowledge and understanding, so they will get confused. Okay, and this can be if you trace back the origin of these ideas, it is based on Aristotelian logic being applied to the understanding of the Quran, which is absolutely you get a bogus result. Okay. Now the school of Epicurus, a native of Samos or Samos, Epicurus, which is born 341 to 270 BCE, moved to Athens in 307, okay, or 306 BCE, and purchased a house with a garden where he and his followers resided. Okay, they stayed there. Consequently, his school became known as the Garden. Although Epicurus was a prolific writer, only a few of his works survive. Okay, 3 letters, fragments of his own nature, okay, of his On Nature, which is his writings called On Nature, and 2 collections of his sayings. Epicurus's works plus those of his 3 chief and 2 collections and associates, okay, Hermachus of Mytilene, Metrodorus of Lampsacus, and Polyaenus of Lampsacus, form the classical authoritative text for generations of Epicureans. Knowledge of his school and of particular Epicureans such as Colodes of Lampsacus, Carnaecus, Polystratus, and Demetrius of Laconia has been greatly expanded in recent years with the publication of critical editions and translations of many of the papyrus scrolls found in the library of the Villa of Papyri at Herculaneum. These scrolls demonstrate that the school was characterized by much intellectual diversity than had been previously thought. The most important Epicureans from the late Hellenistic and Roman periods were Zeno of Sidon, his students Philodemus of Gadara, Lucretius, and Diogenes of Iononanda. Famous for their quietism and cultivation of friendship, the Epicureans advocated imperturbability, as the ideal and sought to cure humanity's fear of the gods, pain, and death by applying the fourfold remedy. Tetrapharmakos. Excuse me, which consists in the knowledge that God presents no fear, death occasions no worries, the good can be easily attained, and pain can be readily endured. Philodemus' work on frank criticism provides insight into the Epicureans' practice of psychagogy, which is the guidance of soul, which entailed the confession of one's fault to other members of the community and the use of frank speech to correct shortcomings and to promote moral progress. Okay. Now, the next one is the Cynics. Okay. The two traditional founders of Cynicism were Antisthenes, which is born 446 to 366 BCE, and Diogenes of Sinope, 412 or 403 to 324 or 321 BCE, with the name of adherents of this sect deriving from the latter, whose nickname was the Cynic, that is, the dog, infamous for their verbal barking and biting and occasional doggish behavior. The Cynics saw themselves as society's watchdogs, who, rejecting logic and physics as indispensable components of philosophy, believed that their austere manner of life and simple dress were in accordance with nature, and that their freedom from the conventions and values of aristocratic Greco-Roman society provided a conspicuous model of self-sufficiency that functioned as a shortcut to virtue and happiness. There was a strong revival of cynicism during the early empire, so that early Christ believers such as Paul were well aware of cynic traditions and adapted them to express their own self-understanding and to address issues within their churches. The most important documents produced by later Cynicism were the Cynic epistles, which were pseudonymous letters attributed to Socrates, and famous earlier Cynics such as Crates. Now the Stoics. The Stoics were a very important group of philosophers because they really influenced a lot of the early Christian movement. Zeno of Citium, the student of Crates, was the founder of Stoicism, so-called because he lectured near the Athenian agora in the painted colonnade, which is called in Greek Stoia Poikile, if I'm not mistaken. Zeno, Cleanthes, author of a famous hymn to Zeus, and Chrysippus, the greatest of the Stoic thinkers, were the most important members of the old Stoa. But Aristus of Soli, one of Zeno's students, wrote a Stoicizing textbook on astronomy titled Phenomena, which is quoted in Acts 17:28. Diogenes of Seleucia, Babylon, was one of the last members of the old Stoa, stimulated interest in Stoicism when he visited Rome in 156 to 155 BC, and appears to have initiated changes in the formulation and presentation of Stoic doctrines that came to fruition into the works of his student Panaetius, which is from 185 to 109 BCE. Usually regarded as the founder of the Middle Stoa, or Middle Stoic school, who shifted the focus of Stoic ethics from the sage to those making progress toward wisdom, and emphasized the duties of civic leaders. His ideas were appropriated by Cicero for his own treatise on duties, but the undisputed middle Stoic par excellence was Posidonius, okay, which is 135 to 51 BCE. The fact that his school was in Rhodes rather than Athens illustrates the decentralization of philosophy that was occurring in the 1st century BC. Unfortunately, no complete work from the Old and Middle Stoa has survived, and that situation changes with the late Stoa. Okay, the late Stoic school was from 31 BC to around 200 BC. Also known as Roman Stoicism and especially Neo-Stoicism. It was the most influential school of philosophy during this period, with some of its most important representatives being Conotus, Chrysostom, who also reflects Cynic ideas. Epictetus, Hierocles, Marcus Aurelius, okay, Musonius Rufus, and Seneca. Okay. There's a fake letter that pseudonymous writings, apocryphal writings, that has a letter between Paul, the Apostle Paul, and the Stoic philosopher Seneca. And I've read it, and it's an exchange of ideas. And Seneca really, really say that Paul is smart and things like that. And so it is. It was, a lot of scholars believe that it was written by later supporter of Paul, and that Seneca never really exchanged letters with Paul. The Stoics attached great importance to the ancient practice of spiritual exercises, which were a source of Christian monasticism. Okay, and their ideas influenced writers as diverse as Lucan, the author of 4 Maccabees, and Clement of Alexandria. Okay? Stoic tenets also appear in works such as the Tabula of Cebes, a work of popular philosophy that also utilizes Cynic terms and Neo-Pythagorean imagery. Basically, monasticism was a movement whereby people would distance themselves from society, and then they would engage in meditation, they would engage in reading scriptures and things like that. And a lot of the early church fathers were monastic themselves, because they have been influenced by the Stoics. The Stoics, they are anti-social, if you want to call it that way, although you have to use this term very loosely. Not all of them are portrayed this way, but basically they shift their philosophical school, which is very prominent in Athens. A lot of these philosophical schools were prominent in Athens, and so they shift it to Rhodes, okay, which is somewhere away from Athens, because they want to distance themselves. Okay, remember, these philosophical schools, they always debate with one another. Okay, they try to refute each other's ideas, and they'll say that their philosophical school or their way of life is actually much better than their peers. Okay. Last but not least, the school of the Pythagoras. Okay. Although this school was founded by Pythagoras, 570 to 490 BCE, and thus was the oldest of the Greco-Roman school of philosophy, it is virtually impossible to narrate the history of this school with Aristotelianism stating that it had disappeared by his time, which is the late 4th century BCE. And Cicero claiming that his friend Nigidius Figalus had revived this sect and its ascetic discipline. The combination of these two ideas has led to the modern myth of Pythagoreanism as extinct for more than 2 centuries. The existence of Hellenistic Pythagorean texts provides literary evidence that Pythagoreanism did not entirely disappear, though it undoubtedly declined in popularity. There was indeed a marked resurgence in the early empire, and the school during this period is known as Neo-Pythagoreanism. Its chief representatives include Moderatus of Gades, Nicomachus of Gerasa, however you pronounce it, Numenius of Apamia, and Apollonius of Tyana. Okay, Apollonius of Tyana was a very important figure as well because he shares exactly, um, well, according to Philostratus, his biographer, which was written about AD 200, so 200 CE. Um, Philostratus, according to Philostratus, and Loeb Classic Library has produced an amazing volume of work on Apollonius of Tyana. So Apollonius of Tyana basically has the same. He is the same miracle worker as Jesus, according to Philostratus. He raised people from the dead. Okay, he does a lot of things that is quite similar to Jesus. And so a lot of skeptics would think that Jesus didn't exist and it was a later invention. Christians who wanted to rival Apollonius of Tyana, and so they came up with this figure called Jesus and things like that. But the skeptics have pretty much been refuted by scholars like Van Voss, scholars like Bart Ehrman, who has written extensively on this, and so forth. Its chief representative includes Moderatus of Gades, okay, okay, and Apollonius of Tyana, whose life and exploits were vividly depicted by Philostratus. So I've just narrated that to you. There were other Greco-Roman philosophical schools such as the Skeptics, okay, and various eclectics who drew on ideas from numerous schools to formulate their own thought. Both Hellenistic Jews and early Christians did the same, which is one of the reasons why philosophical concepts and terms appear in their writings, and why both Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity frequently resembled school of philosophy. Okay, and this is very, very true. Rabbinic Judaism, as well as early Christian writings, especially from the patristic or church fathers, they were pretty much heavily influenced by philosophy. Pretty much for the early church fathers on Stoicism and Neoplatonism. And Rabbinic Judaism is pretty much the same influence, because during the period of the Hellenistic period, ever since the conquest of Alexander the Great, and there's a lot of studies done by Epicurus around this. There's one book in particular, Judaism, Practice and Belief, by Epicurus. He analyzed the first century BCE and the first century CE, and how the practices of Judaism actually was during this period. And you can see that the Hellenistic Judaism, meaning Jews that have adopted Hellenistic ideas and have introduced them in their study of the Torah, you can see that there's a shift in the ideas, and this is prominent as well in before that even. If you analyze the documentary hypothesis, because there are certain parts of God that have been depicted as anthropomorphic, and there are certain portions in the scripture that completely reject this idea. So even in the Torah itself, you will find, and this is way before, according to most scholars, this is way before the Hellenistic period. So there is always a gradual influence leading up to the Hellenistic period, and religions and Judaism is not monolithic. Okay, it is diverse, and even till today, okay, even though the core tenets, the Shema, is still being preached, but it is how they understand and how they interpreted the scripture that have been the main issue of contention here for scholars of early Rabbinic Judaism, as well as scholars of the ancient Jewish literature. Baker Academic has produced a very important work as well on Judaism, and for you to understand, there's a book, if you want to know more about the Jewish part of it. There's a book called the Behind the Scenes of the Old Testament, and ancient Near Eastern thought and the Old Testament. And if you want to know the history about the communities, the world around the Old Testament, okay, all published by Baker Academic. And it is also a compendium such as this. This book does contain chapters on Herod and a little bit about Judaism, but this is mostly catered towards the period of the New Testament era. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope this video has been helpful to you. To summarize this whole thing up, philosophy was pretty much the main form of education, and it is a different kind of education. It is more rhetorical, whereby there's a lot of debates in the symposium, there's a lot of debate in the gymnasium. Gymnasium is a place whereby people would study, okay, and mostly we have reports where people would study naked and things like that. It is different from gymnasium of today, okay. During the time of the Hellenistic period, Jews would reverse their circumcised mark, okay, and apparently some of them actually succeeded. If you read Dale Martin's introduction to the New Testament history and literature, apparently some of them succeeded to cover up their circumcised marks, just so that they can participate in the Greek activities. And so some Jews, diaspora Jews, no longer practice circumcision, and their main form of education was philosophy rather than reading the Torah. And Paul was from Tarsus, northern Syria, southern Asia Minor, southern Turkey. And Paul's main form of education was philosophy. Okay, Paul pretty much was a cynic, although you can also consider him to be his ideas to be somewhat Platonistic even, and there's a couple of works that have analyzed his writings. You can refer to the works of Christopher State, who has written extensively on the early influence of philosophy. Also works published by a scholar, I forgot his name, but From Plato to Christ, that is the title of the book. That is not a very long book, but in it itself you can see the development of the ideas from Plato to the time of Jesus. And so all of these writings and rhetorics influenced the church fathers, because that was their main form of education. Before they became Christian, or before they adopted Christianity, they have been schooled under Greek philosophy. And so people like Origen of Alexandria, Clement of Alexandria, they all have been, when they read the scripture, they read it from a philosophical point of view, yeah, especially Origen, which is why later on Augustine of Hippo, he really rejected this idea. He rejected philosophy, as well as other church fathers as well. But yeah, Origen really wrote extensively against the world around him, and you can find this work from his book called The City of Gods. So anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I hope this has been helpful to you. I'll see you on my next one. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.